welcome back to Consumer Says. I'm Sophia and I'm here with my co-host Kayla. Hi Kayla, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Sofia?
I'm good. We have a really fun episode today that's going to be different than our past episodes. We actually are going to have a guest who is from our politics team at Morning Consult. Because of the election, Kayla and I try to stay out of politics. We're economists and we like to focus on the economy without politics. But because the economy is such a big part of most elections, and especially this election with everything that's gone on in the past couple of years, we thought it was unavoidable to talk a little bit about how the economy and the election are affecting one another, and what voters and consumers have to say about that. So, we are going to talk a little bit just about consumer sentiment first. So, I wanted to ask you, Kayla, about a temperature check on consumer sentiment, and maybe we can kind of briefly talk about what consumer sentiment is as well, for those who are less familiar. So, where are we at with consumer sentiment?
That's a great question. And this has been a very closely watched metric and sort of puzzled over metric the past few years. I'm going to really focus on our own index of consumer sentiment that Morning Consult puts out. We actually ask consumers on a daily basis. And it uses the same 5 questions that the University of Michigan has used for, many, many decades. But our history goes back to 2018, and we have it at a very high frequency with a lot of demographic detail. So that's the index of consumer sentiment that we're looking at a lot. And it tends to correspond pretty closely with other measures of sentiment as well. So where are we at with that? So really the big puzzle has been, you know, many indicators about the economy have been very positive for the last couple of years, or at least improving in the last couple of years. But the level of sentiment has remained stubbornly pretty far below its pre-pandemic level. That being said, we have had a pretty strong recovery since 2022 when it reached a low point. And I think we all agree that that seems to be driven by improvement in inflation. That being said, it also looks like that gap between pre-pandemic conditions and current conditions is still mostly, I think, being driven by the way consumers are experiencing the high cost of living and kind of indications that they're still struggling with it. And the reason we think that is because digging into the 5 components that we average for that top line sentiment number, the 2 that are really way below their pre-pandemic average are current buying conditions, which looks at things like, is it a good time to buy appliances or a car or a house, something like that. That's well below where it used to be, the level. And then also current personal finances, which I think, most people have a job. We look at employment data. It's probably not from that. So we really think it's on the cost side.
Yeah.
And so
And
you want to know a temperature. What would I say? Maybe 60 degrees? Because we have had that strong improvement, but we're just
mhm,
not, it's still not looking great historically.
yeah. Sometimes I like to think of the temperature as the placement in the calendar year. So I would say it's like a 60 degrees in spring because we're
Yeah.
kind of moving upwards, especially as the cost of living problem seems to go away a little bit more as wages continue to grow faster than inflation. Inflation, we just had a great inflation reading a couple days ago with PCE being nearly at 2%. So yeah, I think that it is cooler than many would expect, considering how many economic measures are presenting quite a strong economy. Inflation, unemployment, GDP, all the big measures really would make you think that people would be feeling better about the economy than they're currently reporting. But Kayla and I think that we can't really ignore the cost of living aspect. And even though inflation has come down a lot of the research we've done here at Morning Consult has shown that people are really unhappy with prices. And so we think that seems to be the biggest part of why sentiment is so muted. And I think the fact that it continues to improve as eases kind of proves that a little bit. There's obviously other things that go into it, like the media landscape and how people are receiving information about the economy, but I think generally it's just the cost of living that's weighing on consumers.
Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
a great way to think about it, where in the calendar year it sits. I agree with you because we were, sentiment wise, we were really in the dead of winter when inflation was peaking. It was up at like 9% a couple of years ago. So, but definitely improving since then. And the drivers of sentiment change over time, but it's
Hmm.
really clearly has been cost of living stuff lately that's been the
Hmm.
dominant.
And also when we ask people over like in many different ways, we try to think of different ways to ask people in our surveys about what's bothering them about the economy. It's always costs. It's always cost of living or like some derivative of that. So, we have to kind of take people for the word at a little bit. There might be other things at play as well, but that's definitely a big driver. But that kind of gets us into why this is such an important topic for the election because unhappy consumers leads to unhappy voters. And so the cost of living and the economy in general has been a huge topic of discussion this election cycle. And you can kind of see it actually in how the policy proposals from both candidates seem to be centered around the economy. So we did a report on this in September. We surveyed people in late August. So now it's been quite some time, which is why we're going to bring on our guest Cam to talk about more what's been happening recently. But I think a lot of that information still holds. One of our biggest findings was that undecided voters, for the most part, seem to prefer Kamala Harris's policies for the economy than Trump's, with the exception of reducing income taxes. Undecided voters, the things that were less popular were tariffs and increasing presidential powers over the Fed. So I thought that was interesting because we haven't really seen people talk about so much how how undecided voters are dealing with are feeling about these specific policies. So that was a super interesting finding. But we're gonna have Cam to talk more about how that still stands. And yeah, do you have anything to add, Kayla, before we jump into that?
No, I'm looking forward to hearing from Cam because, as you mentioned, this report was really interesting when you ran it. Our survey data was really interesting when you ran it because I do think there's this narrative, oh, people consider conservatives or the Republican candidate to be better on the economy in general. But then digging down to these narrow issues, we were seeing something a little different where actually Harris's policies were a little more popular. So that's really interesting. And like you said, it's been about a month since we last looked at this data. So I'm eager to hear from Cam about some updates and sort of what his take is on all of this, because he's very in the weeds with the voters. Whereas, as you mentioned, we're more digging into the economic numbers for the most part.
Okay. Well, let's bring Cam on and get into that. Okay, so with us we have Cam. He's the head of U.S. politics here at Morning Consult. Thank you so much for joining us, Cam.
Thanks for having me.
So he's our expert here, and we can't wait to pick his brains about the election. And it's actually already started. I was going to say it's coming up. It's actually already started. And by the time this comes out, it'll be election day. So Cam, can you give us a brief overview about where we're at in the polls here between the two presidential candidates?
Yeah, happy to, Sophia. Basically, we're looking at the closest election in terms of polling averages and the forecasted models than we've seen in many cycles. Certainly, it looks closer to all the prognosticators than it did in 2020 and 2016. There's just a normal polling average in both directions. Excuse me, there's a normal polling error in both directions, separating, either Kamala Harris or Donald Trump from winning kind of all seven battleground states: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. So really, I mean, I don't think we should be surprised at any outcome once the votes are tallied and the calls are being made next week.
And so Sophia and I, as economists, we're really focused on kind of the economic part of it. That's kind of our theme in this podcast. And I feel like this narrative that I see a lot in the media is, oh, like these voters care about the economy. That's good for Trump, bad for Harris. Like, to what extent is that kind of true based on what you're seeing in the polling? Or is that more conventional wisdom?
Well, the economy is perennially voters' top issue, which is to say that it is very important to the largest universe of eligible voters. Having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean it is going to be the particularly decisive or galvanizing issue in any particular election. What I will say is that whenever the economy is most important, which really just comes with any issue that's important, is when there's a very big contrast between the two candidates. When one candidate is far and away favored by a much larger amount of the electorate than the other to handle the economy. And that was something that we saw in our earlier tracking when the race was between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and that's something that we've seen change a little bit over the past few months as Kamala Harris ascended to the top of the Democratic ticket.
And yeah, that's really interesting. And that's something I noticed in Sophia's report also. And another thing we were interested in that you might have an opinion on is, we see this sort of overall trust for the economy. To what extent do you think voters are weighing that versus how they feel about actually the individual economic issues? Because one thing that I thought was really surprising in Sophia's report was how a lot of voters, despite this overarching theme of trusting Trump more on the economy, on individual policies, a lot of Harris's policies actually seemed a little more popular, particularly with undecided voters. Does that matter, or is it more the overall trust, do you think, that's like really going to determine votes?
I think it definitely can matter, and it kind of depends on the voter. But what I would say is that when we're asking voters generally what they think about the economy, what they're mostly talking about, based on what our own kind of research suggests, is they're talking about things like prices at the grocery store or at the gas pump. They're talking about inflation, so whether prices are going up. They're talking about housing costs and things of that nature. So I think a lot of campaigning and presidential policy is kind of based more around the labor market and the jobs market and things that can be done for the economy in terms of production, gross domestic product, et cetera. But when it comes to what really moves the needle for voters, it's them getting hit in their own kind of pocketbook. And I think if you look at 2024 and the way that we've seen inflation come down over these past few months, I think that has been a factor in that transition at the top of the ticket, making voters a little bit more inclined to want to hear Kamala Harris's economic message and to maybe give her a little bit more credit on some of those specific economic policy issues.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thank you. Um, so another thing that kind of Kayla hinted at a little bit is that, and you also, is that the difference between trust between Biden and Trump was really wide when it came to the economy overall and specific economic issues. But that gap has almost completely narrowed depending on, when we ask. How do you think that has happened? Do you think that's more just because she's the vice president and so people don't associate her as much with Bidenomics, or do you think that's more just a result of how she's proposed these policies or conducted her campaign?
I think what you mentioned there with specifically the Bidenomics branding and just the fact that maybe voters don't necessarily see the vice president as ultimately responsible for the economic track record of success under administration is certainly a plausible explanation. I think one of the most difficult things that we do looking at this data is kind of trying to understand the relationship between policy and personal popularity in politics. I think that kind of relationship certainly moves in both directions some way, kind of like public opinion in general, which traditionally will filter from the kind of top down. But at times, it's also kind of a symbiotic relationship with people, elected leaders at the top of the system, responding to kind of that stimuli from regular people and kind of taking cues from where they would like to see policy headed, or really just a change in the status quo if they're expressing, disagreement with a certain policy. So, I think the fact that just Kamala Harris wasn't Joe Biden was
Mm.
like a big enough kind of opportunity to create kind of a, an immediate vibe shift. We saw that immediately. The trust just went way up even before, Kamala Harris had really gotten on the campaign trail and put any of these kind of proposals out. At the same time, it's not entirely vibes though. We've seen some movement late in the campaign on some of the issues that Harris has spent a lot of time talking about, price gouging, including having, expanding Medicare's ability to negotiate prescription drug prices with drug makers, the way that she's hit Trump's proposed tariff policy as inflationary and it's effectively, a tax cut. Those have all been huge features in both paid media and in earned media and the interviews that she secures and does. And we've seen, that gap on those specific issues, taxes, mortgage rates, healthcare costs, that sort of thing. Those have all closed late. That clearly shows, a campaigning and information effect to me.
Now that's super interesting. I didn't know that. So it's interesting to know that that's fed into voters. And I think the Bidenomics thing is really interesting because we talked about this before you came on, but the consumer sentiment issue in the econ world is a big thing that everyone's talking about, how people are so unhappy with the economy even though it's been doing so well. And I think the Bidenomics framing and word was to combat that issue, and they obviously did not know that Kamala Harris would take over, and then this would actually kind of benefit her because she could escape the branding with the economy with herself. So it's interesting how all of that played out. And you mentioned how some of these issues she has kind of made ground on in her campaign and through her messaging. Do you see that coming through to swing states as well, or is that more just like on a national scale?
Yeah, actually, those kind of late moving trends that I just mentioned, those are from our battleground state tracking with Bloomberg News. So that's
Mm.
among likely voters in Arizona, and Georgia, and Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I know a lot of people like to look at, national surveys and say, well, who cares? Who cares about what the voters think nationwide? That's not how we, elect presidents. That's not how we elect politicians of statewide office. But I think if you look at a comparison of any kind of sentiment in these composite kind of battlegrounds, it more or less looks pretty much like what you're seeing at the national level.
Mm.
So that's definitely a clear signal that we can take in terms of where voter perception is headed. It's not noise.
Interesting. Well, thanks so much. Just a quick last question. We get a lot of questions a lot from our clients and people we work with about how the outcome of the election will affect the economy. And a lot of it depends on actually what happens in the other races in the House and the Senate. So, in particular, the Senate, there seems to be a little bit of uncertainty. Can you maybe give us a little bit of a preview or overview of what's going on in those Senate races and how that might affect which party takes power?
Well, let's look at both the House and the Senate and the current makeup. It's a super narrow majorities for Democrats in the Senate and for Republicans in the House. Looking at Senate races coming in with Joe Manchin's retirement in West Virginia, that pretty much takes that seat off the board for Democrats already. They are also defending two other seats in deep red territory. John Tester of Montana, which nearly all polls show him losing to his challenger, Tim Sheehy, and Sherrod Brown of Ohio, which, our own tracking shows him falling behind recently to Bernie Moreno. The Republicans are, they really only need one of those two seats now after West Virginia to unseat Tester or to unseat Brown to take a majority. And that's if Harris wins the presidency. If Trump wins the presidency, then West Virginia is all they're going to need to have that tie-breaking vote in the Senate. And so for all of those reasons, Republicans are definitely favored to take the Senate. For Democrats to keep it, they would need to keep the Tester seat and the Brown seat and win the White House, or they would need to only lose one of those seats and then pick off either Ted Cruz in Florida or Ted Cruz in Texas or Rick Scott in Florida, which just look like, close but no cigar races for the Democrats at this point. So, I think your expectation should be a Republican Senate heading into next year, regardless of who wins the White House. And then when you're looking at the House, I really just, given how close it is, it's just a 4-seat majority, 4-seat advantage for Republicans right now. I don't see a world where Kamala Harris is the president and Democrats don't manage to take the House, just given where some of those competitive seats break along the kind of competitive electoral college battleground. By the same token, if Donald Trump wins, I think you have to expect Republicans to keep the House as well. So, I think based on what happens at the very top of the ticket next week, what you're looking at is either divided government with a Democratic White House and a Republican Senate, or a Republican trifecta with full control of Washington's kind of political and policy levers.
So if Trump does win, he might have an easier time actually
Yeah.
getting his policies through than.
Yeah. So it seems like our most likely scenario, if Trump wins, is we're more likely to get those economic policies that he's been brought up, and that could affect the economy in whatever ways. Tons of people have done a lot of research on how that would affect the economy. I encourage people to check it out. But if Kamala Harris wins, it's probably kind of like more of the same when it comes to economic policies, because there will be likely gridlock due to the Senate. Well, thanks so much, Cam.
Thank you for having me. I had a great time.
Yeah, this was really helpful. Stay tuned next week, everybody. Or 2 weeks from now, we're going to be probably talking about the holidays. Kayla, do you have anything to add before we log off?
I just want to thank Cam for joining us, our first guest, and I learned a lot, so thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much. Bye.
So honored.